I have worked as a park ranger for more than 20 years, most of them in the state of Montana. The park where I spent the majority of my career covers thousands of acres of mountains, forests, and high-altitude lakes. People often think of this place as untouched beauty, but when you stay out here for long enough, you learn that beauty can hide something else. When I first joined the Ranger Service, I was in my mid-20s, fresh out of college with a degree in environmental science. I thought I was ready for the wilderness. I thought it would be about hiking, trail maintenance, and guiding tourists. What I didn't realize was how much time I would spend completely alone, in areas so quiet you could hear your own blood moving in your ears. By the time the story happened, I was already an experienced ranger. It was the summer of 2007, and I had been stationed at a backcountry cabin near the Timberline. For anyone not familiar, the Timberline is the elevation above which trees can't grow because of the cold and wind. The cabin was about as remote as you can get in the lower 48 states. To reach it, you had to hike for almost a full day from the nearest dirt road. Supplies came by mule every 2 weeks. My duty there was to watch for wildfires, check on hikers who might be in the area, and make sure no illegal hunters were operating in that section of the park. Most of the time, it was routine. The air up there was thin but clean. The nights were cold even in summer, and the silence was overwhelming. You could spend days without hearing another human voice. I had always thought I was comfortable with that solitude. I even welcomed it. It felt like being a guardian of something ancient and pure. But that summer, something happened that made me rethink everything. I still have trouble talking about it. Even now, years later, I feel a weight in my chest whenever I try to describe what I saw and what followed. The first week of my assignment was normal. I patrolled the ridges, checked the trails, and kept notes in my logbook. The radio worked fine, though I rarely heard from the main station unless there was some weather update. The cabin itself was simple but strong, built from heavy logs, with a tin roof that rattled in the wind. At night, I would light the kerosene lamp, eat canned food or dried meat, and read old books left by rangers before me. It was on the second week, during one of my patrols near a narrow valley, that I started to notice things that didn't sit right with me. At first, they seemed small. A tree scarred in a strange way, boot prints where there shouldn't have been any, the feeling of being observed even when no one was around. I wrote them down like I always did, thinking it was probably just hunters or hikers off trail. But soon, it became clear this was something else, something I couldn't explain with simple answers. The first thing that stood out to me was a series of boot prints in a muddy patch near a creek. At first glance, they seemed normal enough, big, heavy work boots. What bothered me was the direction. The prints led straight into a thicket of deadfall trees, where no one in their right mind would go. It was a tangled mess of trunks and sharp branches, almost impossible to walk through without cutting yourself. I followed them for maybe 20 yards before they just stopped. No turning around, no fading into the soil, just gone. The ground beyond was soft enough that I should have seen at least some impression. But there was nothing. It was as though whoever made them walked straight into the pile of broken wood and vanished. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the person had climbed over the fallen logs, and I just missed the signs. Maybe the prints belonged to an old ranger patrol, but something about them felt fresh, like they had been made within the last day. A couple of mornings later, I woke up to find the cabin door slightly open. I always locked it before bed, even though the lock was more of a formality than a real barrier. I told myself I must have been tired and not latched it properly, but a part of me didn't believe that. I checked inside, nothing stolen. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the idea that someone had been inside while I slept. That same evening, while walking along a ridge near the Timberline, I noticed scratches on a group of pines. They weren't bear scratches. I had seen plenty of those. These were higher up, too high for a bear, and carved in strange diagonal patterns. The bark was stripped clean, leaving pale wood exposed. It looked almost like symbols, though I couldn't recognize any meaning. By the end of that week, I started hearing things at night. Not the usual sounds of animals, but something different. It was faint, like footsteps moving around the cabin. Sometimes slow, sometimes fast. I would step outside with my flashlight, but the beam only cut through the first few feet of darkness before being swallowed by the forest. Every time, the sound would stop as soon as I opened the door. Sleep became harder. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, certain that someone was standing just outside the thin log walls, listening. One morning, while checking a section of trail, I found a small pile of stones arranged in a careful stack. Not unusual in itself. Hikers sometimes leave cairns to mark paths, but this was different. The stones were placed directly in the center of the trail, blocking it like a warning sign. On top of the stack was a single strip of cloth, weathered and gray, tied into a knot. I didn't touch it. Something about the way it was positioned made me feel like I wasn't supposed to. When I returned to the cabin that afternoon, I noticed something that froze me in place. Right in front of the door, pressed into the dirt, was a single boot print. Large, deeper than the ones I had seen before, like someone had stood there for a long time, just staring at the cabin. That was the first time I radioed the main station. I told them I might have poachers in the area, maybe even someone trying to mess with the ranger station. They told me to keep an eye out. But since I didn't have proof of illegal hunting, there wasn't much they could do. They promised to send another ranger up the trail when they could, but with the schedule and distance, that could take days. For the first time in my career, I felt something I couldn't quite name, an unease that went beyond normal fear. The wilderness had always been my workplace, a place I respected but never feared. But that week, it felt like something was pushing back, something that didn't want me there. And then, one night, I finally saw it. It was the 4th week of my assignment when everything escalated. The night was colder than usual, with clouds hiding the moon. I had been writing in my logbook when I heard it, slow, deliberate crunching of footsteps on the gravel outside. Not the quick scuttle of an animal, not the heavy shuffle of a bear. These were measured, human-like steps. I froze, listening. The steps circled the cabin once, twice. Then silence. My hand went to the flashlight, but for a long moment I couldn't move. The air felt thicker, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath with me. Finally, I forced myself to get up and open the door. The beam of light cut across the clearing, landing on the trees. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. But just at the edge of the timberline, I thought I saw a figure, tall, unnaturally still, facing me. I blinked and it was gone. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the shadows, but deep down I knew I had really seen something. That night, I barricaded the door with the heavy table from the corner of the cabin. I sat awake until dawn, every muscle tense, waiting for something to break through the walls. But nothing happened. When the sun came up, I told myself I'd been too jumpy. That stress was getting the better of me. The next day, while checking the valley trail, I found something that turned that fragile reasoning into ash. In a patch of mud not far from the creek, there were more boot prints. But this time, they weren't moving away or vanishing into nowhere. They were circling, round and round in a tight spiral, pressed into the earth as if someone had walked in endless loops for hours. In the center of the spiral was another pile of stones, but this one had a dead bird laid neatly on top. That was when the dread turned into something heavier. It felt less like I was being observed and more like I was being marked. On the 6th night, I woke from shallow sleep to a soft creaking sound. The table I had used to block the door was shifting. Something was pressing from the outside, not violently, Not like it was trying to smash in, but steady, as if testing my defenses. The wood groaned under the pressure. I sat on the bed, gripping the flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other, though I knew neither would do much good. The pushing went on for minutes, then stopped. My heart hammered, so hard I thought it would crack my ribs. The following morning, I stepped outside and found more evidence. Around the cabin, carved into the soil itself, were shallow marks like someone had dragged a stick in long, deliberate shapes. They curved and crossed in patterns I didn't recognize, stretched across the entire clearing. The strangest part was that they hadn't been there the evening before. Whoever, or whatever, made them had done it in silence during the night, while I was just feet away. I reached for the radio, but static filled the channel. No voice, no connection. I tried again and again, moving the antenna, stepping outside, climbing onto a rock. Nothing but static. That was when the isolation hit me harder than ever before. I was alone, cut off, and something out there wanted me to know it. That evening, as the light faded, I stayed inside with every lamp lit. Shadows danced on the walls, and I kept catching shapes moving at the edges of my vision. Around midnight, I finally heard it clearly, a voice. Not loud, not shouted, but whispered through the cracks of the cabin. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, deliberate, taunting. For the first time in my life, I considered abandoning my post. Rangers are trained to respect duty, to protect the park no matter what. But that night, staring at the trembling lamplight, I felt like I was up against something that didn't belong to any duty or job. Something older, something that lived in that wilderness long before the park existed. When the dawn came, I packed my bag. My plan was to hike down to the main station, even if it took me all day. I needed to see another human face. I needed to know I wasn't losing my mind. But before I left, I saw one last thing. Right outside the cabin door, in the dirt where the boot print had been earlier, was a new print. Larger than before, deeper, pressed with a weight that didn't seem human. And in the center of the print, as if carefully placed, was my own pocket knife. I had left it on the table inside the cabin. That was when the realization struck me. Whatever this was, it had been inside, not just circling, not just scratching outside. It had crossed the boundary. I didn't think. I just left. The hike back down was a blur. I don't remember stopping for water. Don't remember the weight of the pack. I just remember the sense of eyes on me the entire time. Every step of the trail. The trees felt closer than before, bending in around me, pressing against my path. When I finally reached the ranger station late that evening, I must have looked half mad. My uniform was torn, my face pale, my eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. I tried to explain what happened, but the more I spoke, the less believable it sounded. Boot prints that vanish, stone piles, voices whispering through the walls. It all came out sounding like paranoia. The other rangers listened, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They said it was isolation, maybe altitude sickness, maybe stress. I let them say what they wanted. I didn't argue. Deep down, I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. I never went back to that cabin. Another ranger took the assignment later that season. Nothing unusual was reported, at least not officially. The logs from that station remain uneventful. Sometimes I wonder if that's true, or if whoever stayed there chose silence like I did. Even now, years later, I can't camp near the Timberline without feeling that same weight pressing against me, the same thought repeating in my head. Some parts of the wilderness don't belong to us. They never did. And whenever I close my eyes, I can still picture that last boot print, too large, too heavy, waiting outside the cabin door, holding something of mine that should never have been touched. That's when I knew the wilderness doesn't just watch. Sometimes it steps closer. Sometimes it comes inside. My name is Daniel, and I worked as a park ranger in Everglades National Park for over a decade. When most people think of the Everglades, they imagine wide stretches of swamp, slow-moving water, and maybe an alligator or two basking in the sun. And they're not wrong. But when you live and work out there long enough, you learn that the Everglades aren't just wetlands. They're a labyrinth. This park covers more than 1 million acres, and most of it is nearly impossible to access without airboats or long treks through knee-deep water. The Sawgrass stretches for miles, broken by clusters of cypress and mangroves. The air is heavy, filled with mosquitoes, so thick you sometimes feel like you're breathing them in. At night, the swamp seems alive with sounds: frogs, insects, owls, gators bellowing. It's never silent, and the darkness feels heavier than anywhere else I've been. By the summer of 2012, I had grown used to these things. My assignments often involved long solo patrols, camping out on small patches of high ground known as hammocks. Out there, you might not see another person for days. Only endless marsh stretching to the horizon. It was on one of those patrols that I experienced something that still unsettles me to this day. Something that had nothing to do with alligators or panthers or storms. It was something I could never file in a report, though I tried. Something that felt ancient, like the swamp itself was moving against me. I had been stationed in the Shark River Slough, one of the most remote parts of the park. My job was to survey water levels, check on wildlife, and monitor any signs of illegal activity like poaching. I had set up camp on a small tree island about 10 miles from the nearest ranger outpost. My tent was simple, my gear minimal. Just me, the sawgrass, and miles of water and mud in every direction. For the first few days, everything was routine. The heat was oppressive, the mosquitoes relentless, but that was nothing new. What was new were the signs I began to notice, disturbances that didn't fit with the natural order of the swamp. At first, I ignored them, but soon, I realized something was out there with me, something that didn't want me there. The first sign was the fish. I found them floating belly up in a small pond near camp. Dozens of them, all at once, as if something had poisoned the water overnight. But there were no chemicals, no signs of contamination. The water was clear. The bodies were untouched by scavengers, which was strange because in the Everglades, nothing edible lasts more than a few hours. The second sign came 2 nights later. I was lying in my tent, trying to sleep despite the humidity, when I heard splashing. At first, I thought it was an alligator, but the sound was different. 2 slow steps, then silence. Another 2, closer this time. It was the rhythm of something walking upright through the water. I unzipped the tent and shined my light, but the beam reflected off the mist and revealed nothing. The sawgrass swayed slightly, as though something had just moved through it, but I couldn't see any shape. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every sound amplified, every ripple of water feeling too close. The next day, I went about my surveys, trying to shake off the unease. That afternoon, while pushing through waist-high water, I stumbled upon a clearing I hadn't expected to find. In the middle of the clearing was a circle of trampled sawgrass, flattened in a perfect ring about 10 feet wide. In the center was a pile of bones, small animal bones, maybe raccoons or birds, arranged carefully, not scattered as if by a predator. The hair on my arms stood on end. I didn't touch the bones, didn't even step closer. I backed away and returned to camp, telling myself it could have been the work of poachers, or maybe even kids sneaking into the park. Though deep down, I knew no one would come this far into the swamp for fun. That night, the footsteps came again. This time, they circled my hammock, slow and deliberate, splashing in the shallow water. I held my breath in the tent, clutching my flashlight, but I didn't shine it outside. I didn't want to see what was making those sounds. In the morning, I found prints in the mud. Not boot prints, not paw prints. They were long, almost like human feet, but stretched, with narrow toes that dug deep grooves in the muck. Whatever it was, it had been close enough to touch my tent while I slept inside. And then, on fourth night, I finally saw it. It was just past midnight when I woke to the sound of water dripping. At first, I thought it was rain, but the sky above was clear. Then I realized the dripping was inside the tent. My heart lurched, and I grabbed the flashlight. On the fabric above me, dark patches spread slowly as the water, or something thicker, was seeping through. I shined the light upward, and that's when I saw it. A hand, pale too long, pressed against the outside of the tent, the fingers stretching unnaturally down the canvas. The skin looked smooth, almost slick, glistening under the beam. I scrambled back, my pulse hammering, but the hand stayed there for several seconds before sliding away. I burst out of the tent, flashlight trembling in my grip. The swamp was quiet, too quiet. The usual chorus of insects and frogs was gone, as though the entire marsh was holding its breath. Then I caught movement at the edge of the grass. A figure stood there, half hidden, watching me. It was tall, taller than any man, its body thin and glistening as though coated in water or slime. Its face was wrong, too smooth. No features I could clearly make out, just hollows where I should be. For several seconds, it didn't move. Neither did I. The silence stretched, broken only by my ragged breathing. Then, with a slow, unnatural motion, it turned and slipped into the sawgrass, not crashing through, not splashing, but gliding, as if the swamp itself parted to let it through. I didn't sleep that night. I sat outside with my back to the fire, clutching the radio, whispering into it again and again. Static was all I got. By dawn, the figure was gone, but the evidence remained. Around the hammock were more of those stretched footprints, circling in tight loops, pressed deep into the mud. My tent was marked with streaks of slime, and inside, the fabric sagged where that hand had pressed down. I broke camp immediately. I didn't care about the survey anymore. I packed only what I could carry and began the long trek back toward the outpost. The swamp was not quiet that day. It was alive with sounds, but none of them were comforting. I kept hearing splashes behind me, always just out of sight. Once, when I turned too quickly, I caught a glimpse of that same pale figure moving between the sawgrass, pacing me as I walked. The worst moment came when I crossed a shallow channel. Halfway through, I felt something brush against my leg, not the rough hide of a gator or the smooth slide of a fish. This was a hand, fingers curling briefly around my ankle before letting go. I stumbled out of the water, shaking, my breath ragged, and I didn't look back. When I finally stumbled into the outpost 2 days later, I was half delirious from exhaustion and dehydration. The other rangers looked at me like I was sick, and maybe I was. My uniform was stained with mud and slime, my eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. I filed a report, but I left out most of what had happened. I wrote about strange tracks, possible trespassers, and unusual animal deaths. I couldn't bring myself to describe the figure, the hand, or the way it followed me. No one would have believed me, and worse, I wasn't sure I believed myself. For weeks after, I dreamed of it. The pale face without features, the hand pressing against the tent, the silent way it moved through the grass. Even now, years later, I avoid the Shark River Slough whenever I return to the Everglades. Other rangers have told me stories since then. Stories of seeing figures in the distance, of finding strange circles in the sawgrass, of hearing footsteps at night. They always laugh it off, blaming exhaustion or imagination. I never laugh. I know what's out there. The Everglades are vast, ancient, and alive in ways most people can't understand. And sometimes, when the air is heavy and the swamp goes silent, I still feel it watching me. Because in the Everglades, you're never truly alone. Something moves in the sawgrass, and if you're unlucky enough, it will follow you home. My name is Claire, and I worked as a seasonal park ranger in Yosemite National Park during the early 2000s. Yosemite is one of the most visited parks in the country, famous for its waterfalls, granite cliffs, and giant sequoias. Millions of tourists pour through every year, but beyond the crowded trails and viewpoints lies a wilderness that swallows you whole. The park covers nearly 750,000 acres, and much of it is untouched. Remote valleys, jagged ridges, and forests so thick you can get lost just steps off a trail. It's beautiful, but it can also be dangerous. People underestimate how quickly you can vanish out there. My assignment in the summer of 2003 was to monitor backcountry campsites near the northern edge of the park, far from the main tourist areas. I rotated between small ranger cabins and field tents, sometimes spending weeks without seeing anyone besides the occasional backpacker. It was lonely, but I enjoyed it. I loved the quiet, the starlit skies, the sense of being part of something older than myself. That summer started normally. I patrolled trails, checked permits, and maintained campsites. But midway through July, I began to notice things I couldn't explain. At first, they seemed harmless, even fascinating. Unusual lights in the forest, strange patterns in the ground. I thought they might be natural phenomena, tricks of the atmosphere, or maybe even campers breaking rules. But what I saw over the following weeks went far beyond that. It was something that made me question the safety of the wilderness I had once loved. Something that followed me in silence until I couldn't tell whether I was awake or dreaming. Even now, when I return to Yosemite as a visitor, I can't hike certain trails. My chest tightens, my vision narrows, and I remember the summer I realized the wilderness doesn't just hold beauty. Sometimes it holds something else. The first sign came late one evening. I was hiking back to the cabin after a long patrol when I noticed a faint glow through the trees. At first, I thought it was a campfire, but the color was wrong, pale blue, not orange. It pulsed softly, like a heartbeat, and seemed to float above the ground. I left the trail and followed it for a short distance, but when I reached the clearing where I thought it had been, there was nothing. The glow had vanished, leaving only the whisper of wind through the pines. I dismissed it as fatigue, a trick of my eyes after hours in the sun. But over the next few nights, the lights returned. Always at a distance, always pulsing, never quite close enough to study. Sometimes there were two, sometimes three, drifting between the trees as though they were alive. I considered the possibility of other people, hikers with lanterns, maybe, but they appeared in areas no one should have been, miles off the trails, and they moved too smoothly, too silently. One morning, I found a circle of scorched earth not far from the cabin. The ground was blackened, the grass brittle, yet there was no sign of fire spreading beyond the circle. In the center lay a ring of stones, each one perfectly white, as if bleached. I hadn't seen anything like it before, and I noted it in my log with unease. Then came the animals. I started to notice deer behaving strangely. They stood motionless at the edge of clearings, staring in the same direction for long periods. When I tried to approach, they didn't flee as usual. They simply turned and walked stiffly into the trees, as though pulled by something unseen. The forest itself seemed different. At night, the usual sounds of owls and crickets faded into silence, replaced by a low hum I couldn't locate. It vibrated in my chest more than in my ears, an almost mechanical sound, but softer, like the air itself was alive. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my duties, but each night the lights came closer. And then, one evening, I woke to find the cabin glowing faintly blue, as if the air itself had changed. I remember the night vividly. The sky was cloudless, the stars brilliant, yet the clearing outside the cabin pulsed with pale light. I stepped to the window and froze. Half a dozen orbs floated between the trees, moving in slow arcs. They weren't lanterns. They weren't fireflies. They were larger, brighter, and completely silent. They drifted closer until they hovered only yards from the cabin. The walls glowed faintly in their light, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. For long minutes, I couldn't move. My breath came in shallow gasps, my body trembling. Then one of the orbs slid forward, pressing itself against the window pane. The glass glowed under its touch, and the cabin filled with that soft hum. Louder now, vibrating through the wood and into my bones. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair, but the orb didn't break the glass. Instead, it pulsed once, twice, and then drifted away to join the others. Together, they circled the cabin in eerie silence. When I finally gathered the courage to step outside, the night felt wrong. The air was heavy, electric. The orbs hovered in a wide ring around the clearing, moving in slow, perfect synchronization. Then, in unison, they dimmed. The forest went black, and in that blackness, I heard something move. Not the orbs this time. Something else. From the tree line, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly thin, its body dark against the faint starlight. I couldn't make out details, only the way it moved, jerky, almost broken, as though it wasn't used to walking. It stepped into the clearing, and the orbs flared back to life, illuminating it in pale blue. Its face was blank. No eyes, no mouth. Only smooth skin that reflected the glow. Yet I felt it watching me. Not with eyes, but with something deeper. Something that pierced through me and left me cold. I couldn't run. My legs refused to move. The figure tilted its head slowly, unnaturally, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Then the hum intensified, pressing into my skull until spots danced in my vision. The next thing I remember is waking on the cabin floor, hours later. The lamps were burned out, my body sore, and outside, the clearing was empty. No orbs, no figure, no sound but the whisper of wind. But in the dirt just outside the door was a perfect circle, scorched deep into the earth. And in the center, pressed into the soil, was a single handprint. Long, slender fingers, far too long to be human. The following morning, I packed my gear and hiked down from the backcountry. My chest ached, my head throbbed, and my nerves were raw. At the ranger station, I filed my report, but I kept the details vague. Unexplained lights, unusual animal behavior, possible trespassers. No one questioned me too deeply. Strange reports weren't unusual in Yosemite. Rangers before me had spoken of odd lights, vanishing hikers, and unsettling sounds in the valleys. Most of it was chalked up to exhaustion, isolation, or people seeing what they wanted to see. But I knew better. I knew what I had felt in that clearing. The way the air itself vibrated. The way that faceless figure looked through me. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't fatigue. It was real. I finished out the season, but never returned to that part of the park. Even now, as a visitor, I avoid the northern trails. When friends ask why, I just say I prefer the southern side, closer to the crowds. I don't tell them the truth, that sometimes, at night, when I close my eyes, I see that pale glow seeping through the trees, pulsing like a heartbeat, circling closer and closer. And I wonder if, one night, it will find me again, because Yosemite is vast, older than any of us, and in some corners of it, the lights still move. My name is David Larson, and I've been a U.S. Park Ranger for almost 15 years. Most of that time has been in the forests of northern Montana, in the stretches where the trees feel endless and the air feels older than people. The wilderness has always been my comfort. even when it tested me. By 2012, I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. I had seen it all. Hikers who got lost but were found the next day, campers who underestimated the cold and needed a rescue, and the occasional animal attack that turned tragic. But I was wrong. It started when a family reported their teenage son missing. He was 17, experienced enough with hiking, and had gone out alone despite the warnings. His last known location was inside Black Timber Valley, a part of the park closed off to the public. The place was notorious for rock slides, sinkholes, and sudden weather changes. Rangers only went in when they had to. I was assigned to search because I knew the valley better than most. I'd been stationed out there before, and my cabin on the valley's edge was still stocked. I packed my gear, shouldered my pack, and hiked in with the same mindset I always had: find the kid, get him out, and calm down the worried parents. But when I returned to my cabin that first night, something was wrong. On the table where I had left my compass and map, there was a folded piece of paper. The cabin had been locked, and no one should have been inside. The note was short, written in thick black ink. "Stop digging where the dead don't rest." The handwriting was sharp, uneven. My chest tightened as I read it again. Someone knew I was here. Someone had been inside my cabin while I was gone. The search had changed. It no longer felt like a missing hiker case. It felt like a warning. The next day, I hiked deeper into the valley. My eyes scanned the ground more than usual, hoping for footprints, hoping for anything. Instead, I found a circle of disturbed earth under a pine ridge. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't natural either. The soil had been dug and filled again, carefully tamped down. The needles covering it were too uniform, as though someone had tried to disguise the work. I crouched and pressed my hand into the dirt. It was softer than the ground around it, sinking slightly under my palm. My stomach turned. It looked like a shallow grave. I marked a spot on my map and kept walking uneasy. About an hour later, I came across another. This one was older, nearly covered by moss, and another a mile after that. 3 disturbed patches of soil in one day, spread across the valley like a trail. By late afternoon, I wasn't just thinking about the missing boy anymore. I was thinking about bodies. That night in the cabin, I locked the door and pushed the heavy trunk of supplies against it. The forest outside was too quiet. Even the owls seemed absent. I didn't sleep well. Around midnight, I woke to a faint sound like something scraping against the outside wall of the cabin. I held my breath, listening. It came in short bursts, like metal against wood. I didn't move, didn't even reach for my flashlight. When it finally stopped, I lay awake until dawn, skin cold with sweat. In the morning, I stepped outside and found another note pinned to the cabin wall with a nail. "The boy isn't the first. He won't be the last." My hand shook as I pulled it free. Whoever was leaving these notes wasn't just trying to scare me. They were confessing something. On the 3rd day, I widened my search. The missing boy was my official reason for being here, but now I was also hunting for whoever was leaving the graves. I noticed patterns. The disturbed patches of soil were spread almost evenly, like markers, and they always seemed to be near old, forgotten trails, paths no longer on maps, grown over with brush. One trail led me to a clearing I had never seen before, a strange open patch surrounded by thick trees. In the center stood an old fire ring made of large stones. Inside the circle was ash, black and gray, as if someone had used it recently. Around the stones were fragments of cloth, shirts, maybe, faded and shredded. I crouched low and sifted through the ash with a stick. Buried under the top layer, I found bones. Not animal bones. Small, pale, brittle. I backed away, bile rising in my throat. This was no campfire site. This was something else. I radioed in to headquarters that evening, reporting what I'd found. The line crackled, and the reply was short. "Copy that. We'll notify law enforcement." But the tone was flat, almost dismissive. It felt wrong, like they already knew. When I signed off, I noticed the radio battery draining faster than it should. The screen flickered and died. I was cut off. That night, I found the third note. It wasn't folded or pinned. It was slipped under the cabin door, so quietly I hadn't heard it. "You walk the same trails they did. Be careful where you stand." By the fourth day, exhaustion and dread weighed on me. I hadn't slept more than a few hours each night. I felt watched constantly. Every step echoing like someone else's shadow was just behind me. Late in the afternoon, I decided to stake out the clearing with the fire ring. If someone had been using it recently, they might return. I found a vantage point on a rocky slope overlooking the clearing and settled in as the sun dropped. Hours passed. Crickets sang. The forest grew darker. Then I saw movement. A figure stepped into the clearing, tall and thin, carrying something long over their shoulder. The fire ring glowed faintly as they lit it, flames rising against the night. The figure crouched and began adding objects to the fire, bundles wrapped in cloth. I strained my eyes, but the distance was too far. At one point, the figure stopped and turned their head, as if sniffing the air. My heart hammered. I pressed myself against the rock, terrified they had seen me. After a long moment, they returned to their work, feeding the fire. I stayed frozen until the flames died down and the figure vanished into the trees. Only then did I move. When I finally made it back to the cabin, there was another note on the door. "We saw you watching." I nearly dropped it. My mouth went dry. Whoever it was, they had spotted me. They knew exactly where I was. On the fifth morning, I returned to the disturbed soil patches, forcing myself to dig despite the dread. With my entrenching tool, I uncovered what I had feared: human remains. Shallow, incomplete burials. Some were decades old, some recent. Then I found a backpack, blue with patches sewn on. Inside were school notebooks, a flashlight, and a wallet with the missing boy's ID. He hadn't just wandered into the valley. He had been taken. The air felt heavier as I repacked the soil. My hand shook, dirt under my fingernails. I wanted to leave, to run back to headquarters, but my truck was miles away, and I still didn't know who was leaving the notes, or how many there were. When I reached the cabin again, the door was ajar. I had locked it that morning. My gut clenched. Inside, nothing looked disturbed, except for one thing. The missing boy's backpack was sitting on my table. I had left it buried in the valley. That night was the worst. I barricaded the door with everything heavy I had, my rifle propped by the bed. The forest outside was alive with noises, branches snapping, footsteps circling. More than one person. They never knocked, never tried to force their way in. They just circled, whispering faintly. I didn't sleep at all. At one point, I smelled smoke and rushed to the window. A small fire burned outside, crackling low. Around it, shapes stood motionless, watching the cabin. Too many to count. By dawn, the fire was out. The clearing was empty. But nailed to the cabin door was the final note. "You will stay here now. One more grave for the valley." I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack, shoved rations inside, and left on foot, avoiding the trails. I cut through thick brush, forcing my way through pine and alder, moving as fast as my legs would carry me. My only thought was to reach my truck at the ranger station. The forest felt endless. At times I swore I heard footsteps behind me, but when I stopped, the woods were silent. I didn't stop again. By late evening, I stumbled out of the valley and onto the dirt road that led to headquarters. My truck was there. I drove without stopping until I reached the sheriff's office in town. When law enforcement searched the valley the next day, They reported finding nothing. No graves, no fire ring, no notes. My cabin was bare. Even the boy's backpack was gone. The official record lists the boy as missing, presumed dead from exposure. My report about the graves and the figures was dismissed as stress and fatigue. But I know what I saw. I know what I found. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. The faint scrape of metal against wood. The sound that followed me in Black Timber Valley. The dead don't rest there. Neither do the living. I'm Mark Hanlon, and I have been a U.S. Park Ranger for more than 20 years. If you ask me why I chose this line of work, the answer is simple. I never felt at home anywhere else. Cities choked me. Towns bore me. The wilderness, quiet, unpredictable, merciless. That's where I feel like myself. Out here, surrounded by trees and sky, there's no lying about who you are. Nature strips people down to their bones. Over the years, I've served in Yellowstone, Shenandoah, Olympic. I've seen wildfires burn entire valleys into ash. I've pulled broken bodies off cliffs and carried lost children back to their parents. I've found men who thought they could tame the woods and ended up swallowed by them. It's not glamorous, not heroic. Most of the time, it's lonely. In 2016, I was reassigned to one of the most isolated places I'd ever been. Dunlow Reserve, a massive stretch of protected land tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Thousands of acres of dense hardwood forest, steep ridges, hidden hollows, and caves that run like veins under the ground. It wasn't on many maps. Few visitors ever made it past the welcome station. The locals in nearby towns whispered about it, but they rarely set foot inside. When I first arrived, the place looked like paradise. Rolling green hills that turned gold at sunset, creeks that ran clear and cold, ridges that let you see for miles. The ranger station was an old cabin perched at the edge of the reserve. It had no neighbors for 20 miles in any direction. Just me, my radio, my truck, and the endless woods. The assignment sounded simple. Patrol the reserve, maintain trails, monitor wildlife, and assist if campers or hunters went missing. Headquarters warned me it was a low-activity post. That should have been a relief. After years of chaotic rescues and endless calls, a quiet post sounded good, maybe too good. I unpacked my gear the first night, setting my maps on the desk and locking my service weapon in the cabinet. The cabin smelled of pine and old wood smoke. I told myself I'd sleep like a baby, but when darkness fell, the silence was suffocating. I'd lived in wilderness before, but there was something about these woods. They didn't rest. They felt like they were holding their breath. 3 weeks into the assignment, I got my first real case. Headquarters radioed, and a group of 4 college students from Kentucky had been reported overdue. They'd checked into the reserve, left their car at the trailhead, and promised their families they'd return by Sunday evening. By Monday morning, there was no word. Their families were panicking. I drove out to the trailhead to confirm. Their sedan was still there, covered in dew, empty. I signed their names against the logbook. They had taken the South Hollow Trail, a 12-mile loop known for steep climbs and loose shale ridges. I'd hiked it myself already. It was challenging, but not deadly. Not unless you wandered off. I set out with a day pack, my radio, and extra water. My plan was to walk the loop, calling their names, scanning for signs of tents or fire pits. Standard procedure. Most of the time, missing hikers were either injured or turned around. But about 4 miles in, I noticed something strange. The trail split where it shouldn't. The official map showed only one path through that stretch, but here, a narrow track led downhill into the trees. It looked old, sunken, as if it had been used long ago. Curiosity got the better of me. I marked my map and followed it. It wound down into a hollow, so shaded the air turned cool. Birds stopped singing. My boots crunched leaves and sticks, but the sound seemed swallowed. I walked maybe half a mile before I found the first sign. A torn strip of blue nylon fabric caught on a low branch. Hiking gear. The students had been here. The trail kept sinking lower, twisting between ridges, until I came upon something I hadn't expected. A weathered signpost, half-rotted, leaning against a rock. The letters were barely legible through the moss, but I made them out. Hollow Deep, 2 miles. The name stirred nothing in my memory. It wasn't on any current maps of the reserve. I snapped a photo, intending to research it later. But then I noticed the ground. A wide circle of ash stained the soil, like a fire pit, but too large for campers. The edges were blackened deep into the roots, as though it had burned hot and long. Around it were broken bottles, rusted cans, scraps of clothing buried under leaves. And on one tree nearby, carved deep into the bark, was a single word: stay. I don't scare easily, but standing there, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The silence was heavier than before. The missing students hadn't just wandered off trail. They had followed something old, something no longer meant to be found, and I had just followed them into it. The days after I discovered the old Hollow Deep sign were unsettling. I hiked back to my cabin, uneasy, and tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was just an old, forgotten logging path, or a campsite from decades ago. The ash circle could have been natural charcoal remnants, and the torn fabric, I told myself, was probably from lost hikers long before. But reason offers little comfort in the mountains at night. The first night back in my cabin, I slept fitfully, constantly waking to the sound of snapping branches outside. At first, I thought it was deer or maybe a raccoon, but the rhythm was wrong. It wasn't animalistic. It was deliberate. Slow steps that circled the cabin, stopping at regular intervals, then continuing. By morning, I found another clue. A small stone had been placed on my doorstep. Just a single, round stone, smooth and blackened as if burned. No prints led to it. No branches had been broken. Whoever, or whatever, left it was careful. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was imagining things, letting the stress of the missing students get to me. But over the next week, the disturbances escalated. While hiking a remote ridge, I noticed dozens of small, carefully stacked piles of sticks. Not natural. Each was almost identical, arranged in patterns. Some trees bore carvings I hadn't seen before, letters, symbols, strange marks that seemed almost like writing, but I couldn't decipher them. On a trail near a creek, I found footprints, bare feet, long and narrow, pressed deep into the mud. Too large for any of the students, too human to be anything else. Every night, I returned to the cabin with a tightening chest. I kept my radio close, but the signal would fade in the evening, static swallowing my calls. Occasionally, I thought I heard whispers outside the window, too soft to make out, but unmistakably human in cadence. I began noticing strange things about the wildlife. Birds avoided certain areas. Deer froze and stared down trails that led to Hollow Deep. Even the insects seemed quieter in that hollow, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then came the first real proof that I was not alone. I had left my binoculars on the cabin porch to dry one morning after a rainstorm. That evening, I noticed they were positioned carefully on the railing, angled toward the back forest. They hadn't been like that before. I knew it wasn't the wind. By this point, I understood one thing. Someone or something was observing me, and it had been watching long before I found the Hollow Deep trail. The next day, I decided to investigate further. I couldn't stay in the cabin wondering. I had to know what Hollow Deep really was. I packed a day's worth of supplies and took the old, overgrown path into the hollow. After hours of hiking, The trees opened into a valley that had been completely hidden from view. My first thought, it looked abandoned, like it hadn't been touched in decades. Then I realized why. It hadn't. Buildings stood in varying states of decay. Log cabins, long rotted porches, rusted metal roofs collapsing in on themselves. Stone chimneys remained intact, but no smoke ever rose. Shattered windows reflected the dull sunlight like empty eyes. The smell hit me next. Not rot, not decay exactly, but a faint, metallic tang mixed with damp earth, like old blood soaking into stone. As I explored the settlement, I noticed disturbing details. Footprints in ash, fresh and dry, leading into darkened cabins. Tools scattered in unnatural positions. Hammers standing upright. Nails hammered halfway into planks, as though someone had abandoned them mid-action. Journals, yellowed and brittle, left on tables. Most were too decayed to read, but I glimpsed names, dates, and references to disappearances spanning decades. It became clear this settlement had a dark history. Hollow Deep wasn't just forgotten, it was erased. Stories of miners, settlers, and their families who vanished without record. The local town historians denied the settlement had ever existed. Official maps ignored it. But here it was, in the middle of the woods, frozen in time. I stepped into the largest building, a long cabin with multiple rooms. On the floor, I found human bones, small, brittle, clearly decades old. Some had been bleached by sun. Others were dark and slick with age. On the wall, someone had scrawled messages in old charcoal. They watch. They never leave. Stay. The handwriting was jagged, panicked, older than anything else in the room. Then I heard a sound. Footsteps. Not from the wind, not from animals. From deeper in the building. Slow, deliberate, echoing across the creaking floorboards. I froze. The sun was still high, and yet the shadows inside the cabin seemed to grow darker, almost pressing in around me. The settlement was abandoned, or so I thought. Something was still alive here. I knew the surface settlement was only the beginning. The locals had whispered about mines under the hollow for decades, claiming the miners never left the rock. I found the entrance near the back of the settlement, half hidden under brush, a gaping hole in the hillside that reeked of damp and decay. Torch in hand, I descended. The air was thick, musty, and cold. The walls were carved rough, but the floor was worn smooth in some areas, like feet had trampled it for generations. At first, I found only remnants of old mining tools, broken carts, and rusted buckets. Then the tunnels narrowed, twisting unnaturally. In places, the rock had been carved into shapes that resembled crude facades of buildings, tiny rooms, hallways, even something that looked like a chapel with symbols etched into the walls. The symbols were strange, spirals, stick figures, and jagged letters I couldn't identify. The further I went, the more I realized this place wasn't just a mine. It had been transformed into a labyrinth of chambers. Some contained human remains, stacked carefully in piles, as though preserved rather than discarded. Others had primitive tools and jars filled with strange, dark substances. I came across a room where the floor was scuffed with claw marks, deep and wide. I felt the first real fear. Whoever, or whatever, had been here wasn't fully human, and they were still here. A faint sound echoed from deep within the tunnels. Footsteps, breathing, I couldn't tell. I froze, torch shaking in my hand. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, but I knew I was being watched. The deeper I went, the more I felt like the tunnels themselves were alive, aware of my presence. I pressed on. I had to find the missing students, and if I didn't, I knew no one else would. Hours into the labyrinth, I stumbled upon signs of life. Not recent campers, but inhabitants of some long-forgotten origin. Figures moved just out of reach of the torchlight, thin, pale, hunched, faces obscured by matted hair. Their movements were unnaturally smooth, silent, almost like shadows slipping across the walls. I realized with horror that these weren't normal humans. Generations of isolation, perhaps twisted by the minds themselves, had changed them. Their eyes, when glimpsed in torchlight, reflected a dim blue glow. They didn't speak, but I sensed intent, intelligence, calculation. Then I found evidence of the students. Torn clothing, a backpack slashed open, and a notebook soaked in something dark and sticky. My stomach turned. Whoever had taken them was still here. A narrow passage led to a chamber with a low ceiling. Inside were dozens of figures crouched or standing motionless, their gaze fixed on me. Some carried crude weapons, others merely watched. They didn't speak, but their eyes followed every movement. The feeling of being hunted was suffocating. I backed away slowly, but one of the figures broke formation and advanced toward me. My heart pounded as I remembered the service pistol in my pack. I raised it, but the figure stopped, staring at me without fear. It was as if the walls themselves commanded it. I didn't wait to test this. I ran, twisting through tunnels, the sound of pursuit echoing behind me. Branching paths, dead ends, and rockfalls slowed me. I could hear them moving with me. Soft steps, breathing, close enough to touch. By late afternoon, exhaustion had set in. I had no idea how far I had traveled. The labyrinth seemed endless, a shifting maze designed to trap intruders. Suddenly, the tunnel beneath me groaned. A section of the ceiling collapsed behind me, cutting off the path and sending dust into the air. Panic surged. I forced myself forward, pushing through narrow cracks and jagged rock. At one point, I slipped, scraping my arm on stone, and a figure emerged from the shadows. I fired the pistol blindly. The shot echoed through the hollow, but the figure vanished, silent as smoke. Then I saw the final chamber, a cavern wider than any room above, filled with piles of bones, scattered clothing, and ancient tools. In the center stood a massive mound of ash, still warm, pulsating faintly with blue light. Around it, the figures circled, chanting softly in a language I couldn't recognize. The ceiling began to tremble. Rocks fell, dust choked the air, and the figures turned their gaze toward me. I realized the hollow itself seemed to react to my presence. I grabbed a lantern, ran past the closest figures, and dove into a narrow tunnel leading upward. The rocks groaned, ceiling cracking above me. I scrambled, lungs burning, feet bloody, and finally emerged into a hidden stream on the surface. The sunlight was blinding. Behind me, a rumble echoed through the hollow as the entrance collapsed. I didn't stop to look. I ran until the reserve road appeared, then collapsed beside my truck. I reported the collapse to headquarters. They sent a team days later, but they found nothing. No tunnels, no hollow, no signs of the settlement. Only a dense grove of trees where the entrance had been. The missing students were never found, and my report was filed but never published. I left Dunlow Reserve soon after, officially reassigned. But I couldn't shake it. I kept the old notebook from the student's backpack, the pages darkened and damp. Symbols inside matched those I saw in the tunnels. I've tried to forget, but sometimes at night, I dream of the hollow. The walls stretch endlessly in my dreams, pale figures emerging silently, eyes glowing faint blue, circling me without sound. The hollow waits, patient. I can still feel it, like a pulse beneath the earth, whispering. Even now, years later, when I return to the Appalachians for work or hiking, I avoid the deep valleys. I tell myself I've moved on, but I know better. Hollow Deep is still there, waiting, and one day, it will claim more. Some places in the world are alive. Some remember, and some, like Hollow Deep, never forgive.